Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Cailin, and I'm an Adult Services Librarian at the Aurora Public Library District. I'm going to take care of some housekeeping before I introduce our speaker tonight. While all of our programs are currently being offered virtually, we do have curbside hold pickup, public computer, and browse and go appointments available at all locations. You can find more information about these services on our website. As a reminder, we'll be recording this presentation and it will be available on the library's YouTube channel. Okay, so let's get to the main event. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes for from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and the Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing and its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Libby, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay, so for the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be asking Libby questions about her book, and we'll reserve the last 15 minutes or so for questions. So please go ahead and type your questions into the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comments. All right, so let's get started. So how did you come to write The Lost Family?
So I was in conversation a few years ago with my editor at the Washington Post, and we were interested in this phenomenon of how DNA testing, which is a technology that has been really marketed for recreational purposes, for entertainment purposes, is in some cases actually yielding really profound results and making people question their understandings of their families, of their genetic ancestries, and of their own genetic origins. And we were interested in this idea that that technology is shaping human behavior in these really unexpected ways. And so, we talked about doing a piece about, one particularly good story. And I went out and I found that story and I wrote it for the Washington Post, and it ran in the summer of 2017. And this piece got this kind of cataclysmic response. There was this just outpouring of emails that I got, hundreds of emails from people all across the US and all across the world who were saying, that was a really good story about a DNA surprise, but I want to tell you about mine. And these stories were they were so striking. They were so emotionally raw. They were so sort of fascinating for their twists and turns and for what they kind of could tell about the vagaries of human nature and how we respond to these revelations and how we come together or don't, and how we embrace one another or don't, and how we redefine ourselves in the wake of new and fresh understandings of our own genetic origins. And so I started kind of gathering those stories. I started talking to the people who had reached out to me, and I wanted to write a book that would sort of try and encompass the intimacy of these very human stories, but also tell a bigger story about the industry and how it came to be, about the technology and how it works. About the science in a way that people could understand, those of us without PhDs in genetics, but who participate in this technology should be able to understand what it is exactly we're doing. And then also, kind of the sociology of it. What is it? What is this grand experiment that we are conducting that has implications for how we think about family, for how we think about things like ethnicity and race, and for how we think about truth and how much truth we're entitled to, and how we think about the past.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So the story of Alice Collins Play Booch frames your book. Without spoiling the story, could you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, so I needed a central narrative that was going to take readers through the book and kind of make them keep turning the page. That was really important to me because this is a mainstream book with a lot of science in it, and I knew that if I didn't kind of give readers a page turner, that potentially they would read the phrase autosomal DNA and centimorgans and triangulation and say, "All right, see you later," right? And so and honestly, the thing that appealed to me most about writing these accounts, is these human quests for identity, and each one of them is an existential quest. So what I set out to look for was a story that was going to read like a novel but be true, and I found it in the form of Alice. Alice is a retiree who lives in Washington State. She is a very, very smart woman who worked in technology all her life and is not intimidated by technology and is not scared of data. And she wound up with basically a data problem in her own DNA, and she set about to try to solve it using data and using technology, and basically just like threw herself into it. And it became a 2.5 year existential detective mystery that she launched herself on. And so the book kind of takes you into her world and helps you understand why her story is so compelling and so important. So just a little about Alice. Alice is someone who thought she knew who she was. Most people who have a DNA surprise, right? It's all there in the phrase, in the word surprise, like they think they know who they are, right? And the vast majority of people who, are testing are not going to get a surprise, but a significant minority of people are. And so for Alice, she tested back in 2012, which was a long time ago in the context of DNA testing for ancestry purposes. The industry itself is 20 years old, but 2012 was when autosomal DNA testing was really starting to come on the scene. And autosomal DNA testing there's different kinds of DNA testing, but some of them, and the ones that were around back in the day, really were telling you about your ancient origins and your ancient migration path of your far off ancestors. And what autosomal DNA can do, and the reason it was such a breakthrough when it came into being about a decade ago, is that autosomal can tell you about your maternal and your paternal relatives, your close relatives on both sides. And it can also give you that ethnicity estimate, which is a pie chart, which purports to tell you where in the world your ancestors come from, anywhere from, say, 500 to 1,000 years ago. So 2012 was when Ancestry, which is a big company a lot of people know about, that's when they unveiled their autosomal DNA test. And Alice, being a genealogist, decided to get in on the ground floor and take this test, even though it was still in beta testing. And she knew that she was going to find that she was Irish on both sides, because she knew that her parents were both Irish with a little bit of British and Scottish thrown in. So she kind of knew what she was going to find, but she figured, well, I'll just break through some brick walls here. And what she found instead was this kind of mystery in the results, which was that her pie chart was wrong. Her pie chart was right, but at first it looked like it was wrong because it was half Irish and British Isles, like she expected. And the other half was Ashkenazi Jewish, which is, Jews from Eastern and Central Europe who have a unique genetic signature that looks different from someone who's Irish, for instance. And at first, of course, she assumes that Ancestry, swapped her vial, or doesn't, they don't really quite know what they're doing yet. But when she sort of tested at another company, that other company, 23andMe, confirmed the results. And then she realized she had a mystery that she needed to solve, and she began to solve it. So why is Alice's story interesting? In addition to the fact that she's like this really smart, funny, warm woman that you want to spend time with, and she has this great analytical brain, her story contains many others. And I say that because, the kind of expected explanations for a situation like Alice's didn't hold water in her situation. The theories that she came up with to explain her unexpected results were the statistically most likely explanations, but they were not the explanations when she methodically investigated. So for instance, she did not turn out to be the product of an NPE. And an NPE is a non-paternity event, sometimes translated as not parent expected. Sometimes it's called MPE, for misattributed parentage experience. And, a lot of the DNA surprises that are coming out now are for people who are discovering they're not genetically related to one or both parents, but typically dad. And so, if you get a pie chart that's split down the middle and half of it says your unexpected ancestry, that's usually going to be the explanation, but it wasn't for Alice. It also wasn't the case that she was adopted. It wasn't the case that she was donor conceived. It wasn't the case that she came from a community that had hidden their genetic ancestry. And it turned out that the answer to her mystery was 100 years in the making. And one of the pleasures of the book was, in addition to kind of writing this detective story with all its twists and turns, was to be able to go back and report back 100 years to the beginnings of her genetic mystery. And so the beauty of using a narrative like that as the kind of thread that pulls you through is that at each step along the way, as she investigates a different theory and she looks at maybe the possibility that she's the product of a non-paternity event, for instance, I get to tell some of the stories from people that I found in my reporting who did indeed discover that to be true in their case, that they were the product of a non-paternity event, or that they were donor conceived, or they were adopted and nobody told them until they tested with a vial, or that they did hail from a community that had, for a variety of reasons, hidden or forgotten its genetic ancestry, and they were just now in this moment of discovery that the industry of DNA testing has allowed us to access.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
it's a lot.
Okay. Home DNA testing is a fascinating phenomenon on many levels, but it is oddly both a curiosity or holiday gift and a profoundly revealing, even life-altering catalyst. How is it both?
Okay, so it is on the one hand something that is marketed as entertainment, right? And if you've seen if you've been near any kind of advertising whatsoever in the last month, you've probably, depending on the searches you do online, but quite possibly seen some ads for a DNA test that, is on sale, and, it's only $49 now. It's usually $99, and you may as well get it, or you may as well get it as a gift for someone, right? And the ads are really compelling. The ads sort of suggest that you're going to get a lot of access to your past, that there's going to be stories revealed that are going to kind of deepen your understanding of who you are. And that's often true, particularly if you're willing to put in the work of doing the genealogy to accompany the DNA, which really is necessary to kind of deepen your understanding. But what people don't usually assume is that their breakthrough is going to sort of threaten a fundamental narrative that they have about themselves or about their families, right? They assume that this discovery is going to come with a certain amount of emotional and historical remove. So it's going to be enlightening about a grandparent. I never knew if grandpa was Greek or Italian, we're going to find out, that kind of thing. I always wondered if I had Native American ancestry because somebody said so once. So let's take the test. And those things are, things that we can engage with, but we sort of don't find our lives kind of really altered by them. But then there's this sort of significant minority of people who are going to find that, that their own genetic origins aren't what they thought. And they're sometimes not prepared. I mean, I would say most of the time they're not really prepared for that. Because they've engaged with this in a totally different context, right? Maybe they've received it as a gift, which is how I got my first DNA test. This is very much a thing that we engage with the way that you would buy someone a gift certificate or, a book, right? And it can be really much more life-changing than that. And so that mismatch between expectations and investment, which is fairly low, and then the results, which are pretty profound for some people, that is the kind of tension that I wanted to explore, and also the questions that are raised by it, and the ways that it invites us all to rethink our own identities. Right. And how we assumed we were formed, and does this then change our sense of ourselves, self-conception? Those things were really interesting to me because I've always been very interested in how we come up with these self-definitions, how we tell our own stories, right? And what I found was that, when your beginnings change, when you understand that your beginnings aren't what you always thought, your genetic origins, the story of your birth, those are like kind of sacred stories that we tell over and over, or we think over and over, or they're just central to our identity. When your beginnings change, it doesn't just change that, it changes everything after. It changes the trajectory, it changes your middle, right? Your once upon a time changes the rest of the story, of the rest of the narrative. And that those explorations were like a big part of what I wanted to kind of explore and tell in the book.
So you've said that one of the realities of technological advances is that their true impact is hard to anticipate. Is that the case with home DNA testing?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at the very beginnings of the industry, it's kind of dramatic, the mismatch, right? In the way in which this was envisioned, and then like what it came to be. There's often with technology a kind of unanticipated consequence. And we're just really bad fortune tellers. We just are, right? So it's not our fault that we can't figure it out. But but if you go back and you talk to the people who came up with this industry, they truly did not see this coming. So the industry started in the US with a company called Family Tree DNA, which is the first DNA testing company for ancestry in the States. It launched its first test kits in the spring of 2000. So that's 20 years ago. And so we're literally this is the 20th anniversary year of this industry. And again, in the very beginning, the tests were different. They were telling you things that, like, by comparison to today's results, are much more crude in terms of ancient origins. And the tests were also much more expensive, and there were fewer people in the database. So it was just much less helpful in terms of real actionable information that you could apply to your family history research. But the guy who invented this company, Family Tree DNA, his name is Bennett Greenspan. And, he told me that he founded the company because he had a genealogical problem. He was a genealogist, he had a brick wall, and he couldn't solve it. And he figured DNA was going to tell him the answer. And in the process of investigating his own genealogy, he went ahead and reached out to a scientist, because he's that kind of guy. He's kind of a serial entrepreneur, and he's just decided to put it all on the line. He calls the scientist at home on a Sunday, and he says to the guy, "I want a DNA test kit because I'm trying to figure out a genealogical mystery, and can I buy one from you?" And at the time, this was in the late 90s that he's making this phone call. That wasn't a thing, right? Scientists were doing testing with what at the time was Y DNA, so the Y chromosome that males carry. They were doing like studies looking at at subjects, and trying to do like surname studies where they were tracing the Y chromosome with last names, and they were doing this really fascinating research, but it was not something that was on the market. You couldn't just go out and buy a test kit. And when the scientists told Bennett, "You can't just buy a test kit," Bennett basically had this breakthrough idea and realized, why not? Maybe you should be able to. And that was the beginning of the industry. And he told me that when he first went to genealogical conferences with his product in the 2000s, he would try to convince fellow genealogists that this was going to be a useful thing. And people were just like, they didn't see it, right? And he would, he would kind of like start talking to them and shake their hands. And then he would not so subtly, or maybe kind of subtly, hard to say, walk backwards without letting go in hopes of getting them closer to his booth, figuring if he could lure them a little closer to the product, maybe he could make a sale. So, the first 10 years of the industry is this story of a niche product for hobbyists. And it's when first 23andMe gets on the scene, but then really Ancestry gets on the scene and puts a great deal of marketing money behind their advertising in 2016, 2017, that this is transformed into a consumer item, something that, you get as a gift for the person in your life who already has everything. And it becomes something that, maybe was just going to appeal to a very narrow swath of people. And it turns into something that is, potentially going to appeal to a lot of people, whether or not they have that much interest in DNA testing to start with, whether they have that much interest in family history, they'll just kind of invest because it's fairly cheap. And what sort of follows from that is that, we share genetic segments with people who are related to us. And the upshot of that is that people are potentially identifiable even if they never test themselves. Because by dint of the cousins that have tested, the people that know them or don't even know them, but who share DNA segments with them, their decision to test implicates everyone else. And so now we're in a situation where many, many people are potentially identifiable by someone who's related to them, even if they're not actually themselves in the database. And that means there's implications for so many people beyond just those of us who've tested, that there's this kind of unanticipated kind of consequence for the American population.
Wow, that feels a little scary.
I mean, there's also been implications for law enforcement. There's implications for genetic privacy. We could not have imagined, and potentially, for sure, in the health industry, and potentially, kind of a coming together between this industry and the medical world. So we don't really know where this is going, right? We still can't tell. We're still crummy fortune tellers, but it's clearly so much bigger than anyone imagined it was, or at least than Bennett Greenspan imagined it was 20 years ago.
I think you may have already touched on this, and I'll just give you an opportunity to say more if you want. With more than 35 million Americans having taken a home DNA test, we say that America has reached a tipping point. What are the implications of that?
Right. So, and it's sorry, I'm opening not a beer, not a beer yet, but a coconut seltzer. So yes, it's 35 million people. It's actually not 35 million Americans. It's 35 million people, but it's the majority of them are American. And so 35 million people is just an enormous amount, right? And basically what that means is that even those of us who have not chosen to opt in are effectively opted in anyway. So if you are somebody who is looking for your genetic dad, and you have no clues as to his identity, you can still probably identify him if you test nowadays, even if he's not in the database. Particularly if you are a white American, a white, European American, just because that's the group that's like most widely represented in these databases. So what does that mean? It means that, that potentially, you could find your biological father because you test and you find a genetic aunt. That would make the job very, very easy. You might reach out to that aunt and you might ask her, potentially slightly awkwardly, who her brother is, and say, I see we're matched and I see I'm your genetic niece. And, I think one of your brothers, if you have more than one, is my father, right? But you needn't even do that. And that's because we leave so many digital breadcrumbs about ourselves online that you could just look her up and probably fairly easily figure out who her brother is. If she has more than one, that it's one of them. So that's a fairly easy way of figuring it out. But it needn't be that the sister of the man who's being sought is in the database. It could be a first cousin. It could be a second cousin. It could even be a third cousin. Now think about how many third cousins you have. There's a statistic somewhere about how many we each have. I don't know what it is, but there's a lot. There's a lot of third cousins, and I don't know their names. They are essentially strangers to me. If they came up to me at a party, I wouldn't know I was related to them. But their decision to test potentially could have implications for someone like me. If if someone was looking for me and they were genetically related to me and they wanted to say, hey, I'm your child, even if I never participated in the technology myself. So, I think that is an important thing to think about, because it means that when you take a test, you're sort of opting in for everyone, in a certain to a certain distance in your genetic family. And it's not the case that this is necessarily a bad thing. It really depends on the circumstances. There are cases where people are reaching out to their biological fathers, and biological fathers are extremely glad to be found. And those stories are very, very beautiful. when we can be kind of expansive, and when people are able to embrace their genetic kin. And I tell some of those stories in The Lost Family. And yet also there are situations where the opposite happens, where this is seen as threatening. This is seen as an invasion of privacy, where the person who's coming to you, even though they're genetically related, seems more like a stranger and a threat than a potential loved relative. And those situations I also wanted to tell in the book because they're the reality of what we're going through now in America, right? And a lot of people wind up in some pain because they wind up being rejected by the people that they most want to be accepted by. And all of this is sort of part of the landscape of what America is experiencing right now.
Let's talk further about the sociological and psychological shifts that you attribute to home DNA testing. Is it fair to say that the sociological shift is primarily a culture clash between past and present, as well as privacy and transparency?
Yeah, yes, I think, if you think about how people previously made decisions about what to tell their children about how they came into the world, there's a sort of striking difference in terms of how we talk to our children now versus how it was 67 years ago. There were stigmas about ways in which children came into the world that were considered things we don't talk about back in the day. And you wouldn't tell that child because you potentially wouldn't want to burden them with that knowledge because would have been stigmatizing, right? Or you didn't see the need, or it was going to be harmful to the child and to you. So for instance, donor conception, infertility would have been seen as very, is very taboo in some circumstances. So much so that in fact there were parents who used assisted conception and used a donor, but didn't know for sure that their children were the product of that donor, because part of the practice of maintaining the kind of fiction of a genetically related nuclear unit was that doctors would mix the sperm of the intended father with the donor, so that there was kind of a plausible sense that they could never truly know, and they couldn't anticipate a future in which DNA testing would be able to tell people. So it was considered best for the child and the father and their relationship together and the stability of the unit and the social and psychological and legal issues. It was just considered best if everyone believed themselves to be genetically related, whether or not they were. And the lack of DNA testing and this act of sperm mixing allowed that to continue. Same thing with, if, a mother, had a child when she was not married, or there would have been circumstances under which, the conception of that child would have been considered, a secret not to be shared. Nowadays, the understanding is that everyone, the children, the families, does better when those children know, those children and then those eventually adults know how they came into the world. So, there's this kind of clash then, this kind of collision that you're seeing in this very moment between like an older generation and a younger generation. And, the younger generation is saying like, I just had this experience of spitting into a vial and being told that I'm not who I thought, and this is deeply traumatic. And I want to talk about it, and I want to know who else is going through this because I want to feel not alone. And can we please normalize this? And I'm going to see, a psychologist about this because I want to work through the emotions, and I'm going to start blogging about it too, right? And that kind of spirit of transparency and sisterhood or brotherhood through the sharing of stories really clashes with the approach of of family secrets, of we don't speak about that. It's the past is a foreign country. The culture is so different 60, 70 years ago, and what I found is that family secrets have a kind of inertia. They don't they don't get exploded just because time passes. So if you make a decision to keep a secret about a family, about a child, say a child's origins, times may change. You may go from the 1950s to the 1990s, but oftentimes there's not a moment when you suddenly go, okay, times have changed, I'm going to tell the child. Instead, it remains kind of frozen in amber. It's made it kind of remains operating under the same logic that the decision to make this secret kind of began with. So you have all this kind of happening in this one moment where a decision that made a lot of sense 70 years ago, 60 years ago, now makes a lot less sense in the contemporary culture. And that winds up leading to some really difficult conversations between parents and children for which there's often very little guide.
So what about the psychological transformation? Would you say that it's primarily related to surprising revelations?
Yeah, so there's important things to say about the psychology for everyone within, I guess you would call it like the triad of the DNA surprise or the family secret, right? So there's the person who's discovering the thing about their genetic origins, that things aren't what they thought. There's the family that raised them, the parents that raised them, and then there's the newly found parent and siblings, the newly found biological parent and genetic half siblings somewhere out there. So for the people who are finding this thing about this news about their own genetic origins, and I broadly refer to people in the book who are seeking understanding of themselves through better understanding of their own origins in the past. I call them seekers. I call us seekers because I kind of include myself in that, because I think even if you're just doing this for genealogy purposes, you can kind of fall down this rabbit hole and become a little obsessive, and I know what that's like. So the seekers who discover that their origins aren't what they thought, there's a kind of there's many different emotions that can come with that. But a lot of people describe that to me as a trauma at the beginning. And there's often a certain amount of denial. So you have people calling up the companies, and the major companies are Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. And you have people calling them up and saying, you switched my vial, or you guys, made a mistake. You gave me someone else's results. And, it's become common enough that people call into these companies wanting advice and guidance and better results because they don't believe the ones they got, that several of the companies now offer kind of elevated customer service lines for the more sensitive inquiries, because it's a thing that happens, right? They need to be able to help people who have special, extra special issues or extra special concerns or queries. So there's some denial sometimes. And in addition to that, there can be anger at a parent for not telling you the truth about your own origins. Then there can be guilt that accompanies that anger because you feel bad about that. There can be a kind of what one psychologist described to me as like an existential anxiety at the loss of identity. There's a sort of sense of that you're somewhat disoriented. You feel unmoored. You may feel like you don't kind of know where you belong on the earth, like a sense of rootlessness. And then often sometimes there is kind of a sense of bittersweetness. The sweetness comes from the knowledge, perhaps, that there are people out there now that you can get to know, cousins, maybe some siblings, maybe a parent who's open to it. The bitterness comes from the sense of lost time, right? From the knowledge that you can't ever have those shared childhood memories with that person because you're in your 50s and you just are getting to know them now. And that mixed sense of loss and gratitude and joy is very, very complicated for people. The last thing I'll say is that over and over, when I interviewed people who had received a surprise about their own origins, the news might be painful, the news might be not something they went out looking for, or something that was easy to reconcile. It might have been something that caused them to have an argument with their parents and maybe some estrangement, or they reached out to genetic kin and they were rejected. But in all of those circumstances, like however it played out, whether it played out with a sort of embrace or a sense of rejection, every single one of them said they were glad to know. And I thought that was really interesting. Not a single one told me, I wish I could unknow this now. If I could go back to a time before all this, I would erase it. Um, because we place a great premium on the truth, just knowing the truth as to the extent that we're able to ascertain it about ourselves, and because it can answer questions and it can inform and deepen our sense of selves.
So you mentioned NPEs earlier, non-paternity events. For better or for worse, these seem like some of the more intriguing stories. How common are they?
So the best estimate that I've seen through population geneticists and genetic genealogists that I interviewed is that it is between 1% and 2% of the population, potentially about 1.9%. So that is more of a significant number if you consider it spread across 35 million people. But it is not the totality of the DNA surprises that exist. The other big bucket of surprises that I came across, there are a number, but the major two, at least anecdotally, that I found was NPEs and the discovery of previously unknown siblings and half siblings. Now, sometimes the recognition of a new half sibling can come because you are finding out that you're the product of an NPE or donor conception. But sometimes it's unrelated to that. It's just that, your dad had a child before he was married to your mom, or, had a relationship outside the marriage and there's another child out there. And so that those two together, and this is a kind of an estimate that I came up with talking to a number of genetic genealogists, was that perhaps that would be in the very low, this is a conservative estimate, of very low single digits. So let's say it's 3%. Certainly it would be 3% if you added in, late discovery adoptees, donor conception, hidden genetic ancestry. It's probably much more than that, but I like to go with a kind of conservative number, the low single digits. If you're spreading that out across 35 million people, you're at more than 1 million people. But that, again, undercounts it. And that's because every sort of surprise revelation contains within it consequences for maybe between 8 and 10 people. If I discover that I'm not genetically related to the man I consider a dad, that has implications not just for me and not just for him. It has implications for my mom and my dad's relationship. And I'm also now discovering that, say, the two brothers I have, who I assumed were full siblings, are actually half siblings. And now I'm also discovering that over, on the other side of the state is a man who is my genetic father. And he has children who I'm now discovering are my half siblings. And that has implications for him, for his relationship with his wife, potentially, and for those newly discovered half siblings. So the ripple effects of this are pretty big. I think you're still muted. There you
go. How do you find that people respond when this happens? Both the seeker who pursued the information and the family members who didn't.
Yeah. So the seeker, I probably walked through like a lot of like the kind of emotional responses that people have. They very often do want to know more about themselves, and they very often do want to reach out. The people on the other side are often not as eager because they can feel threatened by that. They may not. And you see it go in different ways. Some people are incredibly grateful. They're saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had a child. I conceived in high school and I didn't know it. This is like a new lease on life. I've discovered, I tell the story in the book about a man named Jeff who discovers that he has, he married and has 3 children with his wife, but he discovers that he has actually a fourth child, a fourth daughter, who's older than all of them, who he conceived in high school. when he was 17, and he didn't even remember. I mean, he remembered dating this girl, but he didn't remember actually consummating the relationship. He told me it sounded like a bad after school special, but he didn't remember, right? And this woman, who by now was in her 30s, turned out as matched to him on Ancestry and reached out and started a relationship. The sort of the kind of deepening of this man's story, Jeff's story, is that he's been living for decades with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a really profoundly degenerative disease, and he's on a ventilator, and he can't really talk. So we did interviews through, he had like a wireless mouse attached to his glasses that he would basically type with by moving his head or his eyes. And so he's been living on a sense of time is precious for a very, very long time. And when we were talking about this idea that, sometimes men, when they discover that they have a child they didn't know about, they feel ashamed or they feel guilty that they didn't take responsibility for this child, even if they didn't know that this child was there. And they will deny the relationship because they're so uncomfortable with it, or for a variety of other reasons why they might not want this relationship. And he said, my time with this disease has taught me that guilt and shame are wasteful emotions, and that none of us have time to waste. And I'm just so darn glad to have this daughter in my life. Her children, and I have grandchildren now, and my grandchildren have come over for a sleepover, and it's been amazing. So, that's like a beautiful, beautiful story. And on the other hand, there are men who, delete their kits when they discover that they have a child that they didn't know about. Or one man sends through his attorney a discontinuance of contact letter. Stop contacting my client, stop, just, leave us alone, kind of thing. So there's a really wide range of reactions.
So home DNA testing clearly impacts some communities more than others. Adoptees, for instance, and the donor conceived. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, a community of genetic genealogists and search angels and adoptees started working on methods of allowing adopted people to find their birth parents through DNA, whether or not those birth parents were in the databases. And those databases at the time were so small that it was unlikely that you were going to find a birth parent in the databases. So you needed to be able to use some techniques to piece that information together without assuming that you were going to have that grand stroke of luck of finding, a parent who'd actually tested, or even a close relative, like an aunt or an uncle. And what they did was they figured out how to use these overlapping genetic segments to their benefit, and to do genealogical research going back generations, and then come back down and do what's called reverse genealogy, and piecing those techniques together, which again, this was all pioneered by basically citizen scientists, not by the DNA companies. A lot of search angels and adopted people were able to help other adopted people find their birth parents, and get around the fact that in many states, original birth certificates are not accessible to you if you are adopted, so you cannot learn the identity of your birth parents. And people who are adopted will often feel very strongly that this is extremely important to know. It's important not just for medical information, it's important for identity and sense of self and a sense of rootedness, and like kind of 1,000 different reasons, right, that most of us don't have to think about because we know, and adopted people very much want to know as well. And so they've been able to kind of make an end run around those lack of access to records through DNA. And similarly for the donor conceived community, this has been, I think, the first case that I know of using DNA to find a donor father goes back to 2004, 2005, even before autosomal DNA existed. And so, this is something that that people figured out how to do for themselves, and it's pretty amazing.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I invite people now to ask their questions in the chat. or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or on Facebook. But before we get to that, I'll just ask you this last question. What did your research reveal about the implications of home DNA testing for the African American community, given the history of slavery in America?
So there's a number of things and like a number of ways that I could answer this question. 23andMe has done some really interesting research looking at the history of sort of the present day history of white European Americans and African Americans, you know, the history of America as told in the genes of these present day Americans. And that's pretty interesting. And so there's a lot we can understand in terms of, you know, the cruelties of history and the way that that very often white owners were taking advantage of raping, coercing enslaved women. And we can see that kind of written in the genes of present day African Americans. So that is a kind of population-wide genetic results that a big company has been able to sort of see that you know, we might have known was taking place, but there's something very startling about being able to see it kind of written in the genes all these generations later. At the same time, there's I said there's a number of ways of answering this question because for a number of populations, the choice to do genealogy can be stymied by a lack of records. And this is particularly true for the African American community because records tend to go hand in hand with, you know, with power, with being sort of higher on the in status in society, right? You have to be literate to have records. You have to have access to paper. You have to have access to a place to store those records that's safe, where it's not going to be burned down. You have to be considered worthy of being written about or recorded. And so, you know, if you happen to come from a community that is descended from people who were enslaved and you are doing research to understand where your ancestors come from, you're going to slam right into a brick wall before 1870. And that's because if you are looking to trace those names before the 1870 federal census, enslaved people weren't named. They were just tick marks, like, you know, they were regarded as property. So they were tick marks in a box belonging to so-and-so. How do you get around that? Again, as for adopted people, as for the donor conceived, as for other disenfranchised, you know, on groups, you know, starting out with an kind of an inherent block, you do the DNA. And, you know, in The Lost Family, I tell stories of like several African-American genealogists and what they're able to find, both in terms of the lives of their forebears here, you know, forebears who lived in slavery and the extent to which they can truly, much more so at least, understand the shapes of their lives. And also in terms of their forebears' existence in Africa before they were taken over. And that's absolutely amazing. There's a story in the book about a man named T.L. Dixon who finds the ethnicity estimate is very helpful for him in terms of understanding his roots along certain branches. But then what's very, very helpful is that he finds a present day cousin living in Africa in the database. And that cousin is able to then tell him a lot of information about the people that they both came from. So that information, knowing the group of people that he came from, their language, their customs, it basically allows him to leapfrog over, you know, over that period of time when his people were taken over and reclaim that knowledge about where that particular branch came from. So that's like a pretty amazing bit of detective work that he's able to do.
Okay, I want to pause here just to give anyone a chance. Oh, here we go. Wes says your presentation has been great. You have covered the topic comprehensively, and the only question I have is, where did you go to college? Most impressive.
That is that was a very long time ago. I went to the University of Pennsylvania a long time ago. I see another one here if you want to read it.
Yeah, Andrew asked this early in the program, and he says, never mind, it was just answer. But he asked, do you think the driving force to buy these kits is driven more by entertainment value? Or
I think it's both. I don't think you can say this or that. Like, it's both. You know, I'll just use myself as an example. I mean, I've tested in 3 different places by now, but 3 different databases. And I can talk about why you might want to test in more than one place, because it sounds kind of weird. But, you know, I got my first test kit as a gift for the holidays from my dad. And like, my dad and my mom had both been doing this DNA thing for a little while. And, you know, is it entertainment? Sure. I mean, it helped that the prices were so cheap by the time they started getting into it, right? I mean, is it curiosity? Yes. It's you know, it's both. It's a you know, it's a response to this unique moment that we're living in, which is this unprecedented access to information about the past. We've never had the ability to find out what we can find out now. There are literally billions of records. I think it's tens of billions of records that are available online right now if you want to do genealogical research. Some of those are through paid subscriptions. Companies like Ancestry and MyHeritage, for instance, you know, you can pay and pay every month, and you can find all sorts of stuff. Some of that is through free, like FamilySearch.org, which is run by the LDS Church. That's free, and you can find many, many records on there. And so that combined with the tens of billions of records combined with the tens of millions of people in the DNA databases means that right now, if you were to test, you would immediately find, on average, if you tested Ancestry, I think the statistic they gave recently was on average, their typical customer gets 50,000 DNA cousins in their database, 50,000. And you don't know all those people's names, right? I can guarantee it. So, you know, we've never lived in a moment where people had access to this much information about themselves, about their own genes, right? And about the families that they come from. And it makes sense, therefore, that that we would all kind of be curious and want to indulge that curiosity, because suddenly it's possible to answer questions you could never have answered before. I think there's also something unique about America in this way. You know, most of us, not all of us, but most of us have come from someplace else. Many of us have come from people who came over generations ago when assimilation was the order of the day, and you kind of let go of certain customs, and you stopped making those weird foods, and you started making like Jello molds or whatever, like was the thing to make at that point in time. And now, you know, there's in addition to all these, you know, information that's available, there's TV shows like Finding Your Roots and Who Do You Think You Are, and there's this kind of boon in you know, this in the ability to answer this question of who am I? And so a lot of people are all of a sudden kind of looking up and saying, who am I? I want that. I want that authenticity, that sense of belonging, that sense of rootedness that I can only get by knowing like where my people came from, where all my various different peoples came from. If you're like me, you're like a mutt and you have like a pie chart with a lot of different pieces of different colored pie in it, right? But you want that understanding, you want those stories. And sometimes in those stories, there's a lot of strength that you can find. There's a lot of stability that you can find in a time when things feel really scary, which is, oh, by the way, happens to be right now. By looking back and seeing, you know, oh, my great grandfather like lived through the Spanish flu and like made it out alive and like wrote about it in his diary, you know. Genealogists will say that this is the stuff that gives them perspective on the past, because, you know, history feels kind of abstract when you look at it in aggregate, but when you can locate it in one of your own people, it feels incredibly specific. And then those people that went through those times are not just, you know, strangers with funny hats. They're like us. And if they're like us, then then we can learn from them. And if they're like us, well, then maybe we could make it through too. So genealogy is kind of magical in that way. And I think that's all kind of coming together to inform this moment that we're in.
I love that. We have another question. Andrew is wondering, as testing becomes more widely available and records continue to build as more people test, what path do you see the global community taking? More individualistic or more of a collectivist turn?
That's a good question. That's a really, really good question. I love that question, Andrew. So one of the questions that I tried to answer in the book is, does this bring us together or does this drive us apart, right? Does a pie chart that purports to be able to tell you that you're 23.2% Korean and 18.4% Swedish, does that make me feel very, very, very different from somebody else? Because it suggests that, the company can tell with such precision the nature of my difference from you. Or do I, in seeing the diversity in my own pie chart, feel more like you, or more like somebody else that maybe in the past I might not have kind of sympathized with, but suddenly I see that I'm like them? And that's a complicated question that we do not have the answer to at this point. It's the subject of a lot of study. And I write in the book, I tried to kind of capture the state of where we are in terms of this question. One thing that does appear to be the case, according to the research of a sociologist at my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, is that genetic literacy appears to play a role in how people interpret their results and whether they see them as reifying or reinforcing people's sense of racial difference and racial essentialism, or uniting us and making us see how kind of how alike we are and how much we share. And I should say, by the way, 99.5% of my DNA is identical to yours and to Andrew's and to everyone here. So the key difference appears to be genetic literacy, according to the sociologist's work, that people who go in with more of a sense of what genes are, what genetics are, what they can tell you and what they can't, that those people appear to walk out of taking a DNA test with more of a sense of commonality and more of a sense of that we're all just like brothers and sisters in this shared humanity, right? And people who go in with low genetic literacy may experience the reverse, more of a sense of difference and a hardening of a belief in sort of the fixed idea of racial difference. And so that's a really interesting finding that I hope we can kind of, if it's borne out by further research, I kind of hope we can use that in a way to encourage us in the better direction. And so I can't answer your question, Andrew, but I think it's like a really, really important question to be asked.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left. So let's end with what advice do you have for people who are thinking of taking a home DNA test?
So, it's important to know if you're testing that, when you take a test, there's this little advisory that the company will give you. The companies, all kind of give this advisory, and it says, you may discover unexpected relatives, or you may find things about your family that you weren't expecting. People I found don't generally assume that that's going to apply to them. Even if they know that it's statistically possible, it's just an impossibility to imagine. And so I don't know how much that advisory helps people, unfortunately. And that's certainly, a limitation of those warnings, but, just know going in that could be you. But also, I think it's really, the advice I guess I would give would be to the older generation, right? The generation that has for very understandable reasons, rooted in the way that history was different and the past was different than it is now, maybe not told their children about the truth of their genetic origins. And so the advice I would give would be to those people to say, consider the possibility that this might be the moment to tell your child, because they're going to find out, right? It's not a matter of if, but when. They don't even need to test to find it out. That's the reality of that's the reality of where we are right now. And so, if you can imagine them finding out from a computer screen and then kind of coming to you and saying, how could this be? You can see that the benefits of getting in front of that, right? And telling them yourself, because it makes a big difference to hear this from the lips of someone who loves you rather than from like your DNA test results. So I would think about that. I wouldn't say rush into it cold. And I can imagine that there's some stories that are too difficult to tell. And I can certainly understand that. And there are really harrowing stories and really painful reasons why people don't tell their children about the truth of their genetic origins. And that's just the reality. But there are people now out there who can kind of hold your hand a little bit. There's a growing mental health community, mental health professionals who will help you. There's, genetic counselors and search angels who have experience with this. And so it's worth poking around to see if there's somebody who could maybe potentially hold your hand a little bit and give you a bit of a sense of how to have that conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Libby. This has certainly been very illuminating, and it's a fascinating topic. So we really appreciate you being with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I loved being here. And, one of my regrets about doing a book tour during the pandemic is I don't get to sign books. But I do have a bookstore near my house. And I can sign books there and they can ship them all over the country, including to Illinois. So if anyone wants a signed book and you want to buy it through a lovely independent bookstore in New York or give it as a gift, there's a bookstore called the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. And you can call the Village Bookstore and they will get a copy and I'll run over there and sign it for you. So
yes,
that's my pitch.
Thank you. I believe we have what's it called again? The Village Bookstore.
Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. Yeah, you have something similar.
I believe we have it linked on the event page for this as well. So people can find it there or just search it.
Great.
But thank you so much again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.